Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Carrie Fallhaber. I'm a senior fellow with JobsFirst NYC, and I'm really pleased to welcome you today to part one of our Adapting to the Future of Work, Transforming Systems to Advance Young Adult Economic Mobility series. This Adapting to the Future of Work event series, it's a signature JobsFirst NYC hosted forum that we started in 2016. It was really to put a spotlight on the barriers that young adults face in accessing economic mobility and to advance solutions that work. This year is definitely a little bit bittersweet because we cannot be with you all in person. These events are usually live and in person, but we're really glad that we can be with you virtually. Give me just 1 second to launch the PowerPoint. Sorry about that. Okay. I'm just going to take a moment to share some webinar logistics and protocols with you. Just make sure that you know this event is being recorded, and we will be sure to share out the recording following the webinar. For this webinar, both the Q&A and the chat functions will be open. Please be sure to submit all of the questions that you have using the Q&A feature only, not the chat feature. You can find the Q&A button if you look at the diagram on the PowerPoint screen now. You can find that Q&A button on the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. There should be a graphic on that menu that says Q&A, and just when you click on that, you'll open the Q&A function and you could put all your questions in there. And we've also enabled what's called upvoting. So if you see a question that you also want posed to our guest speakers, just hit the thumbs up, and the most popular questions are the ones that we'll present to our guests. Use the chat feature, which you can find on that same bottom menu, to communicate with each other, to comment. That's more for the community of attendees today. And then use the view options, which is in the top right of your screen, to choose side-by-side mode. And that's the best way to see both the PowerPoint presentation and our guest speakers. If you're having any technical problems at all, just send an email to jpierce@jobsfirstnyc.org. That's Jessica, and she will try to help you with any technical problems that you're having. If you can't find these buttons, you could email her. And if you can find them, you could message her in the chat. We will have folks from the JobsFirst team monitoring both the Q&A and the chat, and they'll try to answer anything in real time that they can. Today's agenda and our guest bios can all be found in the public Google Drive folder, and you'll find a link for that folder in your chat now. And like I said, this is JobsFirst's first big virtual event, so please be patient with us as we navigate Zoom webinars to bring you an exciting lineup of guests today. We're really thrilled that you could join us. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Alan Mohmeyer, the chair of JobsFirst NYC's Board of Directors.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. To some of you. On behalf of the board of JobsFirst New York City, I would like to thank all of our partners for their immeasurable service during this most difficult time. Most especially, I want to thank our funders who have been steadfast, as always, in helping us to continue our work and sharing our work with you. I want to welcome all of the guest speakers today. They represent the National Forum. We're going to be speaking about the issues facing our population, not just in New York, but from all over. So they represent every different part of our country. Many of you have attended our summer forums before. They were all in person. We were planning on doing that again this year. And then the pandemic hit, and we came up with this way, which allows us to have not 150 or 200 people, but by my last count here, it's 350, and there's probably going to be more as we go along. We hope that you learn a lot from this. I want to give a bit of history on JobsFirst to everybody here. We were launched 14 years ago. At that time in New York City, there was 187,000 out of school and out of work young people between the ages of 18 and 24. There were additional 50,000 who were unemployed and unable to find a job. They had once had one. Across the country, there were 6 million out of school and out of work young people aged 18 to 24. It's very significant to note that as time went on, after we were founded, and many of our partners at this forum here were founded, that since that time in New York City, we were able to cut that number roughly in half. And we were making progress every month. And then the pandemic hit. Overnight, the unemployment of our target population, 18 to 24, went to 35%. That's twice the unemployment figure of any other demographic group. So the need that existed back in 2008, how great that was, it exists again, and it's even greater. That's what this forum is all about today. That's what our paper was about, is what do we do now that we're facing a completely different landscape? So this forum, we went out and we found experts, people that are leading their communities in fighting this battle, and that's who you're going to hear from today. And so once again, thank you for coming. I hope that you get a lot out of this, and please come back to the future seminars that we have this summer, this fall, and on into the future. Thank you, and I want to introduce our President and CEO, Marjorie Parker, who is going to lead the next session.
So I am also new to this, so I'm not sure, Carrie, if I'm on, because I cannot see myself. But welcome everyone to this afternoon of 2 hours of reflecting on the 500 questions that you submitted. I want to echo Alan in thanking all of you for joining us this afternoon. You know, we received over 500 questions, and we tried our best to make sure that we use those questions to frame the conversation that we're going to have today. Up on the screen, you should see the agenda. I'm moving a little bit quickly here. There it is. We have a series of conversations that I have the pleasure in today. Usually we're in a building and we have several facilitators, and I don't have to worry about my makeup or lighting, but I'm going to do my best for you today as we try to answer those critical questions that you shared. So understand the national landscape, learning from other cities, and reimagine the young adult workforce development system is really what we're trying to do today. We have 6 sets of conversation. We have a conversation with Shakima Fulmore-Townsend and Robert Saint from Philadelphia and Los Angeles, Alfred Gerber and Martha Ross, Alfred from Casey Foundation, Martha from the Brookings Institute, looking at national perspective on this issue that we're addressing today. Samir Lamfeldi, who is a young adult entrepreneur and New York City resident, who will talk to us about what we should expect, what young adults should expect in the new market. And then we'll end with Stephen Lynch, Burning Glass, who I think we had the most questions for and have to figure out the best way to do it. So thanks again for joining us. We hope that as we make it through to it today, we'll be able to share with you the findings that we had from our early impact COVID-19 and young adult workforce development, insights from the field. We spent a couple of weeks, about 4 weeks, talking to our nonprofit partners across New York City. We did some one-on-one interviews, we had some online roundtables, and we did surveys. And we collected that information in this report called The Early Impact of COVID-19 on the Young Adult Workforce Development System. I want to share with you seven insights from this report. Some of the emerging questions that came up during the conversations. And at the end of the conversation today, I will share with you some of the recommendations. So the first insight that came back from the 78 agencies that we talked to is that household finances are declining rapidly as COVID-19 exacerbates pre-existing inequalities in the areas of food, housing security, and financial insecurity. Two, we heard that having a job has become a matter of life and death, not just employment. And what that means, our parents are worried about sending their kids out to get jobs when they don't have the proper protective equipment. Three, we heard that the pandemic is causing young adults to face greater competition for jobs, internships, and work-based learning experiences. And we get a lot of questions from you about how we want to resolve that. Four, insight from the field from our nonprofit partners. Young adults and nonprofit staff are facing rising mental and physical health needs. Fifth, the transition to remote teaching and learning, as many of you know, is not meeting all the needs of the young adults and will negatively affect their skills training and their educational progress. Funding is flexible right now, but nonprofits are bracing for drastic public cuts. We've heard from a lot of our partners about the cuts they already had as a result of, for example, some youth employment being cut here in New York City, several after-school programs being cut, and those fundings being cut impact their ability to continue to serve the young people that they serve, but also many of their younger staff work on these budget lines. And so many more 18 to 24-year-olds are out of work this summer. Not only those that were already not working and are already not participating in the flush of the economic opportunities that we have, but those who got jobs as a result of these after-school programs and summer programs are now going to be unemployed. And finally, what we heard from the field is that the future of the labor market is uncertain, leaving workforce providers and job seekers without a roadmap. Now, out of this conversation were three emerging questions that I think as a field we need to answer, and we'll try to answer some of that today. One, how can the workforce development field better prepare young adults for shifts in the labor market brought on by this pandemic? Now, we know that in some communities, young adults were not participating in the labor market at high rates, and even if they were participating at the low wage, entry-level jobs levels, and they therefore were not benefiting from what I call the flush economy. What innovation can the impact can curb, and let me repeat that, what innovation can curb the impact of reduced staffing, layoffs, and the loss of talent in the nonprofit sector? Because this is what will happen as nonprofit downsize and close programs and lay off staff. We will lose talent, and we have to determine as a sector how we're going to go about addressing those issues. And then finally, how does the workforce development field become more engaged in policy decisions on the economic rebuilding at both the city and the state level? So these three questions are part of the series of questions along with your 500 questions that we use to frame the conversation that we're going to have now. So it is my pleasure to welcome next Shakima Fulmore Townsend, the President and CEO of the Philadelphia Youth Network, and Robert Saints, Assistant General Manager, Economic and Workforce Development Department, City of Los Angeles. Welcome, Shakima and Robert.
Welcome.
Shakima, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me? I can't see you though, but
I can hear you and I can see you. Welcome. Thank you.
Okay, great.
For joining us. You are, my two friends that we spend time talking about how to fix systems and align systems and integrate systems. So I'm really happy to have you here today. But I want to, if you heard anything that you'd like to respond to from the the insights that I just shared, or from what Alan said, feel free to do so. But I want to start by asking you this question, because this is a question that we get a lot. So we all talk about much about the young adult workforce development system, but what exactly is it? And what does it look like in your city? What are some of the assets and challenges? And given the sudden change in the economy, how's the system or the network of systems responding to this moment?
Well, that's such a great question. I'm happy to start, and always welcome the opportunity to join friends. I'm here in Philadelphia, but I'm a Brooklyn girl at heart. That's where I was born and raised. So whenever I get a chance to be with fellow New Yorkers, I'm always excited about that. So thank you for having us. Yes, Brooklyn, stand up, loving the chat right there. If you, Carrie, could put the slide up for our system, I'm happy to explain how we think about systems. And so I think it's important to note that here in Philadelphia, one of the things that we intentionally decided was that we wanted to work with multiple youth serving systems. And that includes education, juvenile justice, foster care, community-based organizations, policymakers, and that can be challenging when you bring different people with different unique languages and different ways that they express their goals for young people. And so that is something, that's a challenge right there, right? Working with different systems is a challenge, especially when you don't speak the same language. So one of the things that we decided to do, we knew that we needed a system that was also just as diverse as our young people are. Diverse in the types of experiences that it offers, and diverse in the young people that we serve. And so we have a system that is focused on providing workforce experiences to young people between the ages of 12 to 24. And we think about that system in phases, right? Are you in the early part of your career journey where we're more focused on awareness and understanding the difference in different career options that are available to you? Are you in the exploration and preparation stage where you are trying out different experiences to see which one best suits you? Or are you in the advanced stage where you are being sort of immersed in training and additional education as a part of your pursuits along your career pathway? What was really important to us was to depict a system that goes beyond career entry, because we didn't just want young people to enter into a career pathway, but we also wanted them to be able to advance along the career pathway. And what you see before you on the screen are a couple of things that are centralized no matter what system we're talking to. And so I think around our flat Stanley or our person with the briefcase are the skills that are needed no matter what the industry is. So I think another important point about the way our system is designed is it's industry agnostic. The other piece is that it is both geared towards entering and thinking about the future of work and what skills will be needed moving forward. It's also skill driven, right? So it's not just about the experience, it is absolutely about the types of skills, no matter what career choice you use, will be needed, whether that's to be able to show up on time, to resolve problems, to work with people who are different from you. And then it's domain driven, like in terms of what kinds of learning or what kinds of experiences will you need as you progress along the career pathway. And so we know that young people will need academic and technical skills, and that might happen in the classroom. It might also happen in advanced training programs. It might happen in the community. We know that young people need access to 21st century skill development, and that can happen on a team, right? You could be learning teamwork and collaboration as the captain of the soccer team, or you could be learning teamwork and collaboration as a part of the dance troupe that's in your neighborhood. But we know that you have some, added skills that you need to have experiences, and we want to take advantage of all the experiences a young person has, not just prescribe, you have to go to this training program. And then there's character development, right? Every young person needs the opportunity to have resilience and mindfulness and curiosity and to cultivate those things. And we do that in relationship with our peers and relationship to other adults, which we sometimes call workplace mentors, or we call them teachers, or we call them pastors. And then the ability to have reflective practice. How do you apply what you're learning to the growth and the goals that you set for yourself? How do you build positive networks? How do you reflect and take accountability for your own development. And so our system is about how every actor can play a role in the development and the progression for a young person. It is not about a specific program. And I think that that's unique for us in Philadelphia. We do have a series of programs that range from summer employment programs, which I'm happy to share more about, to our longer term training programs with like CBS and pre-apprenticeship programs. So we use some of the same vernacular that everybody else uses nationally, but the foundation of our system is skills-based and learning-based.
And that's fantastic, Shakima. I always just really admire all the work that's done in Philadelphia, and we try to follow you as closely as possible. So in Los Angeles, much around the systems building is exactly how we've approached the work. And starting, as Alan mentioned, back in 2008, we did start ourselves. And I actually made my own field trip to New York City, to Philadelphia, and a couple other major urban areas to actually see what were the best practices. And in Los Angeles, we had some very good programs. The school district was doing good programs, the city was doing good programs, the county was doing good programs, and then they shall never meet, and they should never collaborate. And it was always my program's bigger, my program's better. And then we weren't getting maximum value for the individual young person. And one thing that this pandemic has shown us is that there's no one system that could address all the needs. For those of us that have been in the field for decades and even have been in the field for a couple of years, you just know that there is not one agency that can meet all the needs of our young people. So we need mental health, we need health services, we need housing, we need employment, we need education, we need mentors, we need social services. And it's incumbent upon us as service providers to bring that together. So for many, many years, I've always, looked at that model where we put the kid or the family in the middle, and then we put all the services and bureaucracies around it. And I always said, what was fundamentally wrong with that outline? And what was wrong with it is that we put the emphasis on the young person to navigate our bureaucracies. And just how we situate that. So the young person has to go to place A to get this service, and place B to get that service, and place C. And then each of the services, they do a case management intake. They have to prove that they're poor or they're in need. They do a separate system and a program with case managers that don't talk to each other. So in Los Angeles, we really did look to bring a holistic approach. So we brought the city, the county, the school district, our community colleges, and our new major partner has been our state universities, together to be able to work at a localized level to be able to address all of the needs of the young people. So as this pandemic hit, we drew right back to our systems and our systems partners. All of our centers, we have 14 youth source centers, and in each of those centers we have school officials, we have community-based organizations, city folks, as well as a whole host of partners. So all of the centers have remained open, or the vast majority of centers have remained open. And although we had to stay at home order, what we did was in reverse. We actually started calling the caseloads and asking that very simple question: what do you need? How can we help? How can we find you that resource? And so we've been contacting hundreds of young people on a weekly basis just to keep them engaged. I think the other important lesson that we've learned through this is that in addition to that, system collaboration is essential. The outreach and the connection to the young people is critical. There's probably no other time greater that we need adults to be adults. We need adults to be able to be there for the young people in terms of their times of need. And then we have to make our services available to them when they need them. So it is causing a whole different way of our delivery system, but it's built upon our value system that we do what's best for the young person. We work in collaboration, and that our outcomes are shared successes. But no greater success is that individual meeting their individual goal or having their individual need met. So we're very proud in Los Angeles of the work that we've done, but it is built on the decades of work that has been done in Philadelphia and the decades of work in New York City, and for the folks that have been in the field working as system collaborators throughout the nation.
Thank you, Robert. Shakima. Shakima, how is given the sudden change, this system that you built, Robert, the system that you built, a large, significant portion of it got built coming out of the 2008 recession. How's that system holding up now, Shakima? What are the pivots that you've had to make in practice and in policy as a result of COVID-19?
That's a really good question. I think the system has a level of flexibility or malleability that lends itself to new service delivery. And so for us, we were right in the middle of when COVID hit here in the country, we were right in the middle of planning for starting summer employment. And to give you a sense of scale, we have 160 summer contracts. We're not quite as big as New York. We don't serve 70,000 young people a year, but we're in the tens of thousands. And it's like 160 contracts, over 80 nonprofit organizations, all who were excited to join the Work Ready family this summer, depending on that revenue, and also depending on those services for young people. And so our system really quickly had to be able to flex towards this new normal and come up with ways that we could support the services to young people. I think a couple of things that are really critical for the system is relationships. So we work with our Workforce Investment Board. We work with our Office of Children and Families. We work with employers. And much like Robert, we spend a lot of time collecting information, and much like JobsFirst, from our partners. Hours on the phone, understanding what were the barriers to moving forward, what was the commitment like in terms of sustaining young people as a part of the economic both relief and recovery, and what was the appetite, what was it going to look like? And then we quickly came up with a new plan. I say that like it just happened like magic. That's not exactly how it happened. It meant a pivot that I had to make was redeploying my entire staff. So if you were the office manager, you were now suddenly the hotline manager and you had to answer questions. If you were my director of executive strategy, you now doubled as the contract manager because we were short staffed. And we literally went through our entire organization and redeployed them in order to plan for a very different summer than we had originally intended to implement the summer. So that was a major pivot. I think the other piece was making the value case that young people should not be left out, and that summer employment provides immediate economic relief in families that need it the most. And so we had some really clear data about, that $6 million that we're putting back out is being spent directly into the communities, and that was something that we wanted to preserve. So to be able to pull together the head of the Workforce Board, the head of the Office of Children and Families, and have real conversations about what were their concerns, what were their unknowns, and what would it take to get their support for a plan was one of the things that our system was able to do because it's built on real relationships. I think the other thing was fast data. We have about 90 partners. We were able to get really quickly, what are your barriers? Can you move to virtual? If we figured this part out, could you figure the next part out? Are you willing to move forward? Do you have the staff? Some of our partners, sadly, I laid off 174 people in 5 days, but I still want to be a part of this because I still want to preserve the services for the young people. And then others were like, we are ready to go. Here's what we need in terms of help. We have a professional learning and development team. They can help customize the services and activities that you're now going from in-person to virtual. So we have a lot of assets within the intermediary within our organization that we've centralized intentionally so that we can deploy it across a system of programs and help not just one kid, but thousands of young people by doing it in a centralized fashion. So those were some of the assets. Ways where the system fails us: immediate relief. I don't know if anybody's been in the process of, deploying relief funds. There's a lot of regulations and rules related to relief funds. And so the idea is to meet the young person's needs immediately. That's very difficult to do and follow all the regulations and establish all of the litmus tests. And so there's been some places where our traditional delivery in terms of services or systems, we typically paid on a check or a debit card. We actually need the ability to PayPal somebody or Cash App somebody, and those protocols don't exist within the organization. So there's been places where the system was completely malleable and able to flex, and there were other places where the system is brittle. And we have to really rethink and go through a series of steps that take much longer to implement. And those are things that, stall the speed at which you move forward. But the good news is we're moving forward. And that's what I'm excited about, that despite every barrier we've encountered, we've just said, how do we get around it, or what can we do instead of it, rather than saying we're just gonna throw our hands up because this is too difficult to figure out in a short window of time.
Good. Robert, I know you probably want to respond to that, but I'm going to ask our audience questions so that you can have that in mind as you respond. This one is from Farhad Asghar from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. He asked, who needs to be at the table to best reimagine how systems can better align and integrate to prepare young adults to become financially self-sufficient?
So that's a great question, because we tend to go back to our traditional partners and to the heads of agencies and folks that run the program. So oftentimes we don't reach back to the young people themselves. So we were just in the process of completing a survey. We had over 1,000 young people respond about what were their needs. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly with that, all the same concerns that were raised in your particular survey, they have themselves. Is it safe for us to go back? Can we do virtual work? How do we reimagine what work is and reconstitute that? So those are the questions that they were raising and taking their concerns into this discussion. I think the one point that I really do want to stress to the audience is really around the system's response to the larger pandemic crisis. We had whole industries in Los Angeles and much like New York City that just dropped. So the entertainment industry, where we have a large number of young people in the entertainment industry, the retail industry, the food service industry, the restaurants. So where we had, in just the city alone, about 450,000 folks apply for unemployment insurance. But when they cut the first run of that data, 42% of those were individuals that are age 24 and younger. So it was a high concentration, as Alan talked about, of this particular population. More interesting, about 53% of those that applied for UI were folks that had a high school degree or less. So it was very, very specific populations that were being impacted. So being able to refashion and recreate how are we going to respond to this crisis is beyond just a traditional summer youth program. We have to be able to tie in and connect the dots between what is coming in the CARES Act, what is being invested at the state, how is the community colleges and the state universities being impacted, and have a much broader vision of what we see as our response from our system. And it's going to be non-traditional folks actually being at the table. And when I say that, for all of us folks that love the youth work, we tend to be at our own table and we talk to each other all the time. But we leave off the hook the city managers and the executive directors of economic development corporations and folks that are making other decisions and the larger decisions and larger budgets. And we need to incorporate them and be the voice with them to actually co-invest. We have a fellow here in Los Angeles named Bill Allen, who heads our LA Economic Development Corporation. And we've been friends and partners for many, many years. And he's the one that raised the youth issue on this young adult population on the UI and said, if we don't do this now and incorporate them in our larger discussion with the Board of Supervisors, they are going to be left out. And it's going to be years or decades before we're able to recover. So we need to be able to get the highest level in public officials. We need to be able to get the highest levels in our industries and the highest levels in our social services to be incorporating young adults in all of the recovery. We not just settle for a set aside of a few $1 million, but to make sure that we're involved in all of the recovery aspects. So the billions of dollars that will be coming in, hopefully from the federal and the state and local efforts, that youth and young adults are fully engaged in all aspects of that recovery, not just a small subset.
Thank you, Robert. Shakima, as the young people say, nothing for us without us. Shakima, do you want to respond to that? I have a slew of questions here. One that seems to be gaining a lot of traction. How are you keeping employer partners engaged during COVID and the current uncertainty?
It's been a challenge. I think for us, we've partnered with our local chamber, we partnered with our Philadelphia Department of Commerce just to stage outreach efforts, right? And to not duplicate, because we recognize that our employers were really overwhelmed with dealing with their own industry issues, and to think past how they would use this moment to support youth employment efforts might have been a stretch, right? In terms of the priorities that they listed. And so one of the things that we did initially was to just partner and align our outreach and look for credible messengers and places where our messaging could be amplified. And then we devised a strategy with partners that, and our initial, to my devastation, initially it was, don't reach out to employers for the first 2 to 3 weeks that this is going on. We know where you are, we know what you need to do, but it's just not the right time and it's going to appear tone deaf. Let's just not do that. And so we had to really rethink, how are we going to be supportive? So we took the role of, first, we're going to engage you and tell you that we have a plan and this is what we're doing and this is how you can help us. And we're also going to provide resources and information that may be helpful to our smaller businesses, mid businesses, and larger businesses. So that was our first effort, to stay engaged and stay in front of them. The other thing that we thought that was important to do was to partner with other folks who were convening critical stakeholders, especially philanthropy. The philanthropy network here locally became a huge ally because the corporate philanthropy partners are members, and that was a way that we could get in front of business. And then we did do individual outreach, but we didn't begin that until like week 4 and week 5. And it's led to some promising results. We're working now with PICO, which is our local energy company, in a very different way to customize a whole STEM track that they could offer to interns for them. And we hadn't done that before. Bank of America as another one that we've worked really closely with. They're huge champions of youth employment, and they did everything from make resources more available to us through their Neighborhood Builders Grant, which we are an awardee, but also to respond to challenges. Like we have a local challenge where if a business invests $10,000 in a nonprofit, they'll be matched by $10,000. And so there's been some tailoring to our approach, but our key strategies are: be a resource first, right? Listen and collect information, and then build solutions together. And that's what we've done to keep employers engaged.
I appreciate that. We're down to, Carrie told me that we're down to about 4 minutes. Shakima, and Robert, last question. Robert, you talk about working with your government partners and trying to bring everybody to the table. Shakima, you're working with employers and philanthropy and your government partners. What do young people need in this time, and how can the system align better across government and philanthropy and nonprofit to serve them?
Yeah, first and foremost is the advocacy side of it. We do need to be able to advocate for the resources. I think some of the really initial reactions to this is that, well, there's no work, so we don't need a summer youth employment program. Mm-hmm. And what we brought together the advocates and said, we will have a summer youth program. It's going to look different. Help us reimagine that. And we've been actually massaging a concept paper to get everybody on board of how we're going to move forward this July. But some folks just want to take the money off the table and say, we need to put it over here because that's where we think it's a greater need. No, we need to be able to advocate for our young people and to be able to have the public investment as well as the private investment for this. And then secondly, we need to have that conversation with our young adults about the skill building piece of it. I think Shakima's approach in that it should be industry agnostic. We do need that skill building approach. And our big institutions need to play a role in that. Individual nonprofits and individual programs, we could hit dozens or hundreds, but we're talking in scale. When you talk about a Philadelphia or an LA or a New York City, we have to have scale, and we need our large public institutions. So as an example, having our CSU system, which has traditionally been our 4-year university system for our teachers and police officers and so forth, them now reaching and working with us to work with our disconnected or our opportunity youth and being able to use their infrastructure to be able to bring resources to these particular populations and making those connections. and surprisingly had never been really done before. And so bringing those partners together and that alignment, but is telling our young people that they have to take advantage of all of the programming and not to be satisfied for this type of program or that type of program. And then lastly, and I say this to the field, we need to have courage. We need to be able to, as we get up every day and how hard this is, and we're facing 20% unemployment rate for our adults, 40% for our young adults. We need to have courage to be able to continue this work and to continue to advocate. So I do appreciate everyone being on here, and I do think we will see the end of this, and we will have a rebuilt system that will be better than what we had before.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Shakima. Everyone, both Robert and Shakima will be back for the last 20 minutes of this conversation to offer some more insights. And thank you for this great reflection that we've had. 25 minutes went by pretty quickly. I look forward to seeing you in about an hour. Talk then.
Thank you.
And now at this time, we want to spend some time. We just heard from the city perspective from two of our leaders from Philadelphia and Los Angeles. We want to spend a little bit of time now to look at the national perspective. And now I want to welcome Allison Gerber from the Senior Associate at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and Martha Ross, who's a fellow at Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institute. Martha and Allison, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to keep talking. So, Martha, I'm going to say the same thing to you that I said to Shakima and Robert. If you heard anything that you want to respond to Shakima and Robert's discussion, please feel free to do so. But I want to start here with a question, and Martha, I'm going to direct this question at you. So, at Brookings, you have written several reports on young workers and how they were faring in the economy before COVID-19. Over the last few weeks, you have posted several insightful briefs about the impact of COVID-19 on young workers and how it will change their long-term economic trends. Can you share with us your early insights on the economic impacts to young adults, especially those who have lower educational attainment and already face greater barriers?
Thank you. The short answer is that it is really, really bad, which is something that everyone who is on this call knows. But when you look at the numbers, the scale is astonishing. So in April, our unemployment rate was 14.7%. That is already higher than what it was at the peak of the recession. So we've already gotten to that level of joblessness. And then when you look at the unemployment rates for younger folks, it's even higher. Now, teens and young adults typically have unemployment rates that are much higher than adults 25 and over. But these numbers are just amazingly high. Among teens, it was 31.9% unemployment rate in April. And as a comparison, it peaked at 27% in the recession. Young adults, 20 to 24, unemployment rate in April was 25.7%. And the job loss has been concentrated particularly in sectors where young adults are overrepresented, and occupations, restaurant servers, cooks, housekeepers, retail clerks, and a lot of these folks were already at the lower end of the wage spectrum. So what I am worried about is that we're going to repeat some of the worst impacts of the Great Recession, the catastrophe of the last decade, which hit younger folks and those with lower levels of education really hard. And I'm worried that we are going to see that again.
Thank you. Allison, I know that the Casey Foundation works with young adult workforce programs all across the country. Can you share with us a little bit about your work now and how, given the sudden change in the system, in the economy, how you are responding to that?
Sure. So absolutely. So hi, pleasure to be with you all today. I love how active the sort of chat and the Q&A has been. It's really dynamic, and I think is a good testament to how we're really able to flex in these times, which is critically important. Just a little bit of context for folks. You know, in Casey's employment, education, and training portfolios, we have a mix of grantees that support young people as they prepare for and navigate the world of work. And across the portfolio, that means we have grantees that are working in a variety of different places within the country, and they're supporting young people at different stages of their education, from high school to workforce development to post-secondary, and helping them prepare for jobs in a range of industries. And I say all that because I think it's really complex when you think of all of that diversity in the portfolio, and like we're hearing a lot of many different things depending on, you know, what group of young people or maybe what place people are in. And we spent, you know, the first probably month of sort of COVID trying to get a better understanding of what was happening and how COVID was impacting young people's education and employment, and how the organizations we support were responding. And quite frankly, we were trying to do all of that without putting any additional burdens on grantees' time, right? Like it was not the time for a survey or written requests for information or other things. And so, you know, I think we heard some complex things. Like we heard grantees saying that they were experiencing, young people were experiencing mass layoffs in things like retail and food service. But then we also heard the same grantees saying they had employer partners who were surging, right, in grocery stores or logistics or in healthcare, and how to kind of deal with that duality, I think is particularly complex. We also had almost every direct service grantee I had moved to some sort of virtual services, but I think how well they were able to move to virtual services had something to do with, you know, what they had in place before. I will say that we heard a lot of some of what we heard from Shakina and Robert, which was like staff's relationships with young people was critical during this time, regardless of whatever, you know, if it was a cell phone you had or it was an online portal, the ability of staff to direct service staff to connect with young people has been critical in sort of stepping into the gap and to using those existing relationships to support young people in new ways, right? I mean, providers didn't have a lot of experience helping young people apply for unemployment, sure, maybe for SNAP or EBT or different things, but stepping into becoming experts in unemployment insurance overnight because they had that relationship to young people is something we heard a lot about. And then finally, I think we heard really different things with respect to state and local governments and their capacity to respond to the crisis, right? And their capacity to step into the breach with respect to food, with respect to cash assistance, with all kinds of sort of things. And largely, I think our primary role during this entire thing as a foundation was to provide as much flexibility as we could to grantees to spend their existing dollars in ways they needed to spend them, regardless of sort of what was in the particular budget line item of the agreement, and putting new money in where applicable into those grants. And then finally, in just feeding back whatever we're hearing to the policy and advocacy experts who are really trying to work on the policy solutions for this work, because philanthropy's money will sort of never be enough, right? And needing to make sure that policymakers really understood when UI wasn't working for young workers, like what was happening that was wrong. So I think that's been a lot of it. And I think at this point, we're sort of pivoting a little bit to better trying to forecast it to the extent that anybody can in this moment. I mean, in any scenario, probably like all of you, you have your scenario A, B, C, but to kind of try to think about what are some of the sort of rapid cycle work that we would want to support as young people are able, you know, to come back into the labor market. What kinds of things would we plan for if we continue in a virtual learning environment, particularly in more denser kind of labor markets? And what have we learned, you know, from past investments that would support that? And where do we just absolutely need new blue sky thinking, you know, ideas that are not fully vetted, but we've never had before, but we're facing a scenario in which, you know, we've never experienced before, and really need to be open to what is not yet known. Last thing I'd say is where I think Casey adds value in this conversation is in being really particular about the needs of young people, and specifically the needs of young people of color and the disproportionate impact that young people are experiencing, and in particular that young people of color are experiencing. And that when we think about these universal policy and systems responses, they're not responding with the needs of young people and young people of color in mind. And if somebody isn't there to kind of say, what about, I think we will miss a lot of the particular responses and the more nuanced approaches for meeting the needs of young people. And I think that's, quite frankly, a lot of what I do. It's highly untechnical, and it's very like, what about?
Right. Definitely get that. We know that coming out of the 2008 crisis, for example, in New York City, almost all the employment gains for young adults were in part-time employment. And it's not because they wanted to work part-time, because those were the jobs that they were able to get. And we all know that these jobs also were in the lower wage sector. Martha, I know you in our conversation and just now, you raised over and over again how concerned you are about, what this time will mean. And a part of our earlier conversation was about how, you think that there are things that we could have done coming out of the 2008 Great Recession. What do we think worked to connect more young adults to economic opportunities in terms of the role that philanthropy has played and the relationship between local systems and the federal systems, and what do we need to do differently now? And Martha, knowing the government plays a significant role in shaping economic activities, what federally funded initiatives work coming out of 2008 from an economic perspective for younger workers? And maybe looking back, what would you recommend that we could do differently this time that we didn't do in 2008? And Allison, I'm throwing that question at you as well.
So there's definitely, it is worth going back to the stimulus legislation to learn from it. But we also have to be careful that we don't then just use it as a model to build incrementally from. So I'll start with saying that I don't think the stimulus bill did nearly enough for young adults or for a lot of workers. The main provision in it related to young people was a big expansion or new federal funding again for summer jobs programs. And a lot of cities and states and counties ran with that, and they revitalized their summer jobs programs. It also included I can never remember, the TACT, the Trade Adjustment and Community College and Career Assistance Act, which put a lot of money towards community colleges and job training and industry partnerships. That was really impressive, and people have pointed to that as, we could have a TACT 2.0. I would caution, though, we would need to make it bigger and longer. It was only for 4 years, and that's not a lot of time to develop curricula and to make a lot of changes in community colleges and to see results. And secondly, I think we need to look at our baseline level of funding for community colleges. Do they have enough for what we ask them to do, which is to serve a whole range of people, many of whom are at all different levels of academic readiness and life stages. And community colleges have far fewer resources, instructional resources per student than do the more competitive schools. And you have to ask, does that mean that we direct resources only to those who are already the most prepared? It seems that we do. Then looking forward, I would say we should think big and broadly, and I would put it in two buckets that are related to each other. One is we should think about economic security and career advancement as a concept. which is broader than workforce development, but it encompasses all kinds of education and the safety net. And then we should think about job quality. What kinds of jobs are available for people? I mean, I think one of the most important questions these days is, where will the good jobs come from? That was one of the most important political and economic questions before the pandemic, and it has only become more important. People cannot achieve economic security and advance in their careers if a huge swath of the jobs that are available in any given region are low wage. And they don't offer benefits or stability or have much potential for upward mobility. And this is especially true for those with less than a bachelor's degree. So people with less than a bachelor's degree make up the majority of our workforce, but only a minority of them will be able to advance out of low-wage jobs that pay decent wages based on the types of jobs that we're creating and employer requirements about degrees and experience. And we should do education and training so much bigger and better than we have been. But we can't only do that because it won't solve our problem. Imagine that every single working age adult had a college degree. We would still need nursing assistants. We would still need housekeepers. We would still need daycare workers. So the jobs wouldn't disappear, nor would the wages automatically increase. So I think we need to think broader and remember that labor market conditions aren't inevitable and they're not acts of God. We can change them. It's really, really hard to change them. Building on what Robert was saying, it requires courage. Building on what Allison was saying, it requires some blue sky thinking. But I think we need to think differently about the kinds of labor market institutions that we have. On its own, the private market is going to undersupply good jobs because they do cost a bit more upfront with an investment in worker training and probably higher wages. But it is a public good. It benefits society to have more people with good jobs, but it doesn't redound immediately back to the employer. So they don't have an immediate incentive to do that in terms of profit. So there is a need for the public sector to step in partnership with the private sector, weave together multiple strands. So workforce development and education, economic development to help regions become more economically healthy and inclusive, business development and consulting to help employers look at their operations and how can they link their worker skills with their productivity and their profitability. And then lastly, equity and inclusion, so that we're not systematically leaving groups of people behind as we often do, generally people of color.
Thank you, Martha, for that. I have a follow-up question. This is from the audience. Given that we're going to have nursing assistant jobs, jobs that are typically at the lower end, lower wages, how do we make those jobs good jobs?
That is such an important question. And one of the problems with it is that it immediately vaults you into this whole arena of healthcare financing, because the way nursing assistants are paid is through health insurance, and often in the case of home care aides, it's through Medicaid. And so then suddenly you're thinking about, all right, okay, so let's think about reforming Medicaid, this gigantic federal state program. But I think we should. I think we have to. There are models about how to do this. There's a clear case to be made that with better quality care, you get better health outcomes. But what you're doing is now you're not only kind of pushing up against like the low wage labor market, you're pushing up against how healthcare is organized and delivered. It's an important battle and a tough one. I don't want to make it seem like there's an easy answer, but I also don't, but it also is possible.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we're making good headways on the good job conversation. And all of us for following that. And as Robert said, this is a time for us to not, not wait and really be bold in our approach to putting in everything that we think should be there that wasn't there in the first place. We have a couple of questions from the audience. This one is more geared towards Allison. Allison, philanthropy is really stepped up during this crisis. In fact, there are several articles out about how well philanthropy has made the pivot to support their frontline nonprofit, and that they've shown notable positive changes in the way that they have risen to the occasion. The most impressive, of course, being funds are being given without restriction at a rate of speed that none of us have ever seen, and a streamlined grant making that everyone's happy about. So this has resulted in less burden on grantees. So how is philanthropy innovating to support this change? What will philanthropy keep and not keep? And then one of the questions and one of the recommendations that I will talk about at the end of this conversation that came from the field is that should philanthropy convert all funding operation support funds and for the rest of the year and the foreseeable future as nonprofits deal with the COVID-19 fallout?
So there's this saying in philanthropy that if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. So I say all that to say I don't feel like I can speak for philanthropy. I don't even think I can speak for national foundations. But I'll just say a couple of things about how I think about this. Like, I am not in favor of unrestricted giving across the board, and largely that's tied to the sort of racial equity and inclusion goals for the Casey Foundation. So think about it this way. I'm super in favor of, in this moment, supporting the needs of direct service nonprofits to pivot because they're best positioned to know what young people need and to be able to change their strategy. And I'll use Martha as an example and pick on her. I'm not necessarily in favor of converting my grant to the Brookings Institution into a sort of general operating kind of grant, right? Like, I think, I'm very interested in making sure that my questions and the research about the needs of young people, and particularly young people of color, gets into the mix. Same way in some of these policy advocacy conversations, if we're not directing those dollars to investigating some of those issues and to highlighting the needs of particular communities and people, those questions are not getting answered. And so I think there's a little bit of like a be careful what you ask for, right? Because I think the other thing to remember is that those organizations that are the most connected, that are usually whiter, have more access to philanthropy and are going to suck up more of those unrestricted dollars. And that's actually, I think, what you don't want. So I think it's a matter of thinking about, like, what is that mix of, like, where are we really flexible with the folks who are doing the direct engagement of young people, who are supporting youth advocacy and youth voice, but then how are we intentionally taking what people on the ground and in communities are experiencing, and then translating that into a policy and an advocacy and a research agenda that moves some of these big picture thinking, right? And I think you want to be on one end very nimble, and on the other end actually a little bit of a jerk, because I think once you get into this, again, this universal service population, we end up talking about a white dominant narrative that's looking at people in their 30s and 40s, and that's not what we here today are about.
Thank you for that. We have 2 minutes left in this conversation, so I'm going to, I see quite a few questions coming in. We'll try to ask those when we bring everybody back together. So knowing, Martha, you and Allison, knowing that young adults have been repeatedly left out of the recovery packages, and given the uncertainties of federal policies now, what and Martha, you talk about this a little bit, and Allison a little bit, what bold collective action is necessary to bring the system together so that we're working more collaboratively to better serve young adults? What policy or funding is needed to support that? What policies are needed to see something bigger realized, something bold and collective that can really transform the systems?
I'll go first, and I'll be quick. I think, well, we don't know when the private sector is going to start hiring again. It has started in some states and some regions, but I'm still, a comment that Dr. Fauci made has stuck with me, which is that we don't set the timetable. The virus sets the timetable. So there, in addition to the inherent uncertainty of any given business environment, there is this public health crisis. In response, what I think we should do is launch a massive federally supported jobs program that would, you know, do everything that you need to do to keep workers safe with personal protective equipment and social distancing. But we have, we can look, and it can incorporate a variety of approaches. Let's expand Youth Build. Let's expand Youth Corps and the Conservation Corps. Let's expand AmeriCorps. Let's do some of what we did in the stimulus, which I should have mentioned before, of giving money directly to states and cities to have them set up their own subsidized jobs programs. And let's make sure that, let's mix in the idea of community service and making communities better places in with this. I mean, there's no shortage of things we need to do in terms of infrastructure, in terms of disaster relief. There's a lot.
Thank you for that. Allison, I'm going to ask you to hold your big bold ideas until we come back at the end, when you can respond to that question and anything else that you'd like to respond to. Thank you both for joining this portion of the conversation, and I'll see you in about 40 minutes. And now we're going to welcome a young entrepreneur from New York City who impresses us every day with her skills, wit, and resilience. Sam Lamfaldi, who's the founder of CEO and founder of the Urban Wild. Sam, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi. Great to see you.
I can't see you as yet, but feel free to respond to anything that you heard before. But again, I will start with a question for you. Can you tell us a little bit about the Urban Wild and how the work that you do will matter even more post-COVID?
Yeah, well, we actually have a slide deck to go along with the presentation. I think we can get started there. I'm just going to say next because I'm not controlling the slide deck, if that's okay. And I do have some thoughts on what the other presenters have said, and I think it's going to tie into a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today and hopefully bring some blue sky thinking. So just as a brief introduction, my name's Samuel Lamfadli. Everyone calls me Sam. It's okay to call me Sam. I am the CEO and founder of the Urban Wild. We are a nonprofit startup based in New York City, if you don't mind sliding to the next slide. Our mission is to make sustainable agricultural technologies more accessible to communities affected by food insecurity. Our belief is that by providing free job training, education, and farm building programs, that we can hopefully foster the next generation of community farmers and urban farmers, agricultural technologists who will meet the food production demands of the future. And personally, this has always been a mission of mine, basically, because I grew up in Brooklyn, born and raised to a single parent household and in an immigrant, first generation immigrant household. And so it really took workforce development programs like Perscolis and General Assembly years ago for me to gain coding and programming skills and end up being able to start my own nonprofit and to bring forth some of the efforts that I learned in technical workforce development by working for organizations like Perscolis and the Knowledge House and Platform by Perscolis and things like that, to be able to start the Urban Wild. And really it was born out of if it weren't for the fact that I understood how crucial and urgent the crisis that we're facing in the coming years is, I probably would not have started the Urban Wild until I was maybe like 40. But just to be perfectly honest, and really, what I hope that folks understand and what I've seen with this COVID crisis is that what we have seen in terms of mobilization, in terms of efforts and urgency in response to COVID is a microcosm of what we actually need to do to respond to the issue of climate change. And so the thing that puts that always in perspective for me, the statistic that I always lean on, if you don't mind going to the next slide, is that by 2025, an estimated 1.8 billion people are expected to be in a water scarce state. And that's obviously like right around the corner. So knowing that is what kind of gave me the impetus to start the Urban Wild a lot sooner than I had imagined. So really, we've been able to adapt fairly easily so far, but mainly because a lot of our work, whether it's programming, internal, external, was based on technology systems, was based on technology competencies. So we were able to transition our internship cohort, which we're currently running remotely. All of our most recent job training alumni are currently employed during this crisis, but in minimum wage work and in remote positions doing technical facing work. But we have, part of what we understood was that even though we were not anticipating a cataclysmic event like COVID, we were founded in anticipation of catastrophic events like climate change. And so as someone that grew up in a food insecure situation and battling it for so many years, what I saw as the threat from climate caused drought, it looks a lot like the threat of COVID right now in our current systems. It looks like widespread food insecurity and food scarcity. It looks like mass food shortages. It looks like skyrocketing food prices and humanitarian crises that we are unequipped to handle. And so really our work was very relevant prior to COVID because of climate change. And if anything, now we're seeing the immediate impact of this accelerated global collapse of our infrastructure. And as much as this, I know everyone on the call is probably exhausted about talking about COVID and feels the emotional and mental burdens of it, unless even the physical probably. As much as it's taxing, I think it's important to understand that this could be the potential for cascading failures in the future. And I think that COVID has given us a peek into what that looks like and how we can respond and adapt much better. So for example, prior to COVID, we were having conversations about what a Green New Deal looks like. And the conversations, when we bring that to scenarios that maybe could actionalize those conversations, the kind of impression was that it was too drastic, too costly, unrealistic, unnecessary. And now we know that we need a complete paradigm shift, whether we're ready for it or not. So my belief with that in mind, if we don't mind going to the next slide, is to kind of focus on where there are opportunity areas. And if this change, this paradigm shift is going to happen, whether we're involved or not, let's get involved. So how do we identify better systems, smarter systems, systems that are more efficient, more effective, and make them accessible to the folks at the bottoms of those systems, the folks that are commonly disenfranchised or overlooked. So the method that we do focus on is sustainable agriculture. We look at advanced farming methods like aquaponics, hydroponics, aeroponics, and integrative technology into those farm systems to make them sustainable, climate resilient, and scalable. And so we have focused on building these systems because they use 90% less water, produce up to 4 times the amount of crops, and even a protein source like fish in some cases, and require no soil, making them a lot safer, making them able to respond to a COVID crisis, for example, by creating indoor spaces that are safe and regulated. And so we started in 2017, really as a volunteer grassroots effort. It was myself and my friend who had access to a shipping container farm in Brooklyn, thanks to Square Roots. And since then, we've hosted workshops and career in agriculture technology and in career development workshops for hundreds of people. We've trained 50 young adults in the skills needed to understand agricultural technology and build their own green spaces and farms. We've built nine green spaces and farms throughout New York City, Kenya, and New Jersey, and hosted 8 programs. And so I guess the last point that I really quickly want to make in terms of how our work is relevant to COVID, in a post-COVID world, is really just understanding that our students have felt the blowback personally, and we've seen it, even though we've been able to kind of insulate them with these remote jobs. Some of them are now the sole earners in their households. Some of them have faced food and housing insecurity very rapidly because of the situation. And some have just been unable to work, period, because of the emotional toll that they've had because of their personal impact from COVID. So not only has this crisis reminded us that our work is important and it's urgent, but it's also strengthened my personal resolve that no idea is too big at this point, and that we do definitely need to overhaul our systems from the bottom up. And so I'm hoping that we can leave today with that understanding and hopefully enact that in our daily lives.
Thank you for that, Sam. So Sam, in the sustainability and resiliency sector, I have two questions here. One, what is the projected job growth? That's a hot question that's coming in. And what's your thinking about how we ensure that young adults benefit from the new economic opportunities? And you can mix into that. You have about 3 minutes. As a young person of color, which you've referenced, how should racial equity factor into rebuilding the economy?
All right, we're gonna love them all. All right, no problem. So I guess to the first question, at the end of the day, I do think that, and my position in terms of the policy change is a federal jobs guarantee. I do think that something like a service corps, not necessarily AmeriCorps, just because it's based on starvation wages. I think maybe we can move to a different model. Could look like something that we would want to enact, and we need to. As much as I love the kind of creative work coming out of my community and out of my organization and things like that, at the end of the day, we do need a system at scale to address these issues, and that's going to come from a federal level. So I'd like definitely to advocate to that end. And I will say, as someone that went through workforce systems, one thing that I noticed was that I knew about Perscolis a year earlier than I had ever attended or applied. And the reason why I applied a year later was there was a relationship between Perscolis, General Assembly, and the Department of Labor. And that's what really made the difference, is that if it weren't for that connection to the Department of Labor and that partnership, I would not have gone through that program. I would not have gained these skills. I would not have worked for companies like Uber and Roku and MIT and all these folks, or been able to start this organization to begin with. So just understanding that strategic partnerships on that level and are effective, and that hopefully that we can have more systems like that. But then in terms of emerging sectors, prior to COVID, there were, thousands and thousands of jobs being created in the agricultural technology field. I would encourage folks in the workforce field to stay away from sector specific. How we focus our work is that agricultural technology is the method that we teach in our programs by building sustainable smart farms, but those skills are transferable to 3 separate sectors. So in the process of building these farms, you'll gain certifications in construction and green construction. You'll understand how to maintain sustainable agriculture spaces, and you'll know how to integrate technologies into systems that need advancement. So then you have a choice to pursue which avenues you are wanting to go down, and we have partners that implement advanced trainings to that end. So yeah, I just think when it comes to kind of changing over the system completely, something that I noticed, if we can go to the next slide, is that I grew up obviously in this situation that workforce development agencies and the folks in the field are battling and working with young adults every day to fix. And something that I think, obviously there's other essential needs for a person, but these are the things that I noticed were the most difficult to pin down, the most difficult to articulate, and the most difficult to kind of move the needle for individuals, which was, obviously air, water, shelter, education, gainful employment, food, internet access, legal representation, and suffrage. And if we can go to the next slide. What was most important about these things was that even if you had them, if they were not safe, if they were not accessible, if they weren't sustainable, and if they weren't sufficient, there was no point. You know what I mean? So keeping that in mind, like I take this from the UN's framework for their 2030 goals for sustainability. We do apply it to our work for our individuals, our young adults that we serve, just looking to make food meet these basic criteria. So I think that if we can use this kind of mentality and thinking when we're advocating for policy change, when we're developing our programs and systems, and seeing if we can create a more holistic and well-rounded approach to these things, we'll definitely have more success.
So Sam, one last question. I'm going to leave that to you. What is it that you want our audience to walk away with today? What is it? It's the last thing you'd have to say. I know you have a lot more to say. We'll come back on the end. We'll talk some more, answer some more questions. Folks want to know where you're located. We'll put that in the chat. And folks want to know how does private companies and nonprofits work better in this green sustainability sector. But what is the one thing? You have a minute and a half to tell us. Tell us something that we should be thinking about.
I think we can go actually back to your question about racial equity.
Okay.
I think that ties to a lot of the concerns that I have generally. If we can go to the next slide. Really, what I focus on mostly is understanding that racial equity does play a crucial role in our actions and in our practices. At the end of the day, I do feel like wealth and income and resource inequality, we've talked this stuff to death. Everyone in this room probably has. But at the end of the day, if we're still criminalizing poverty, if we're still criminalizing people's differences in identity, if we're still valuing people's lives based on what they contribute to an economy that doesn't include them, we're going to continue perpetuating these pre-existing structures of racism and wealth inequality and disparities. And we're seeing those exacerbated by COVID. We're seeing those amplified by COVID. These are nothing new. But I think my disagreement with most people when it comes to this situation is that at this point, incremental change, it might not be the solution here. It might not be the way. I feel like we need to kind of develop a 10-point agenda for what our change looks like, for what our basic needs look like. And at the end of the day, I do go always back to the quote from Wes Jackson that says, if your life's work can be achieved in your lifetime, you're not thinking big enough. And so I would love for people to understand that the outcries you're seeing on social media are because people are disenfranchised. People have a lot more leverage to be able to hold people accountable through social media, but that's a piecemeal solution. And that I'm hoping if we can kind of be a little bit more adventurous with our solutions, that we can do things that, keeping in mind things like the New Deal, keeping in mind inspirations from our revolutionaries that have come before us, do things like creating our own currency and financial systems using whether it's crypto or CDFIs or newer ideas, and really getting off of the financial systems that are holding us, that are keeping folks unaccountable, buying properties collectively. I'd like to see folks boycotting megacorps and creating and building their own local small business networks that they buy and build from. I'd definitely love to see people growing their own food, but together. I would certainly love for manufacturing to come back to our communities, but in a way that we can do it through 3D printing. We can create 3D printing smart farms that are locally accessible and really generating revenue and income for folks locally. And then lastly, of course, is that 10-point agenda for advocacy. At the end of the day, I don't think that we have had the solidarity behind our solutions. I think that we have been disjointed in some of our messaging. And so it would be really great if we can reimagine the system with a kind of centric element around community. And understanding that I cannot do this alone. You guys cannot do this alone. We all cannot do this alone. We cannot reimagine and achieve this vision for a new system alone. And so I'm hoping that folks have learned from this crisis, the way that I learned when, growing up in a food insecure situation, that we're all in this together, that our fates are all tied together. And so hopefully that when we leave today, we can divest from our older systems, we can invest in new ideas, we can advocate collectively. And if you'd like to join us, please let me know and we can get you onboarded to hopefully our Sustain NYC Alliance, which is a partnership between us, the Urban Wild, the Knowledge House, Soulful Synergy, and currently Westcott. So please join us in these efforts to try to change the system from the bottom up.
Thank you, Sam. Always inspiring. You always make me want to work harder. Every time I listen to you or talk to you, I feel that I should be doing more. We're posting all the information in chat. There are a lot of folks who want to know where you're located, so we're putting that in chat, and it'll be in the Google Docs when we, at the end of this convening. So now we are going to, I'm so inspired, Sam. Thank you for that. We're going to welcome Stephen Lynch, who is Vice President for Workforce and Economic Development at Burning Glass Technologies. I have to say, Stephen, welcome.
Thank you.
I have to say, Stephen, we had 500 questions that came in. And I am going to say maybe half of them would have been they're directed at your work. Everyone wants to know what the market is going to look like. But at first, Stephen, I want to start with, you are doing a lot of research. You are looking at the market around the country in other places. Can you share with us some of your early insights that you're seeing in the marketplace, how that the marketplace is changing and impacting young adults as you see it in your research, and especially those already left out the labor market, so they weren't in the market, that were looking for work. Can you share what you're learning, what you're finding?
Sure. Big topic. My slides up. I may be able to bring you through some of this. Rather than burying you in too many numbers, facts, and figures, I'm going to try to focus on some of the takeaways and explain what the data is showing in a way that I think is part of my larger message. It's got to be accessible, useful information. So in response to your question, let's hit the high notes. We are seeing demand since the COVID crisis started down everywhere. So that's not unique to New York City or any area in particular. You can see here the decline in job postings March to May across the US. I'm in Massachusetts, you're in New York right now. We're about the same, about 48%. Overall, the US is down 43%. We've seen major contractions in industry, most heavily hit accommodation, food service, education services, real estate, rental leasing, finance, and manufacturing, down quite a bit. What's interesting is COVID seems to have exacerbated and actually laid bare, though, some underlying trends that were prevalent and beginning to emerge beforehand. Yes, it was a very positive job market overall. There were a lot of postings, unemployment was very low, though not for everyone, as we know. But generally speaking, the situation was pretty good, and then the world got upended. And not just for us. If we can go to the next slide, this is actually a global issue. This is just data we pulled from some of the other markets that we have data on. You can see major impacts and declines in the UK, Australia, New Zealand. We're really seeing declines across the entire EU28, what we've looked at, nations. So we're not alone, but it doesn't help that this further exacerbates the problem, since we're in a global interconnected economy, as we've been talking about for at least 20 years. I'm going to try to bring it to some of the opportunities, though, that we might be able to realize moving forward. If we can go to the next slide, the data is showing us that there are certain occupations and populations of workers that are more vulnerable than others. Most at risk are jobs that were already at risk of disappearing over the next 20 years due to the forces of automation. And that story has changed and evolved over the past couple of years. It used to be people were talking about automation and the negative impact it would have primarily on low skill workers that were in labor intensive tasks, that were repetitive labor intensive tasks. But now increasingly with the emergence of artificial intelligence technologies, we actually see there's a major impact on white collar work as well. Purely analytical functions are going to be remarkably easy to automate moving forward. So we've mapped data nationally. We can actually, heat map where are the occupations by geography that are most risk of disappearing due to the forces of automation. And I'll get into later really what you can do about that. What's the path forward? Also, clearly, because of COVID, roles that require more physical proximity are disappearing faster or have been shut down for a period of time, with the exception of those roles that were deemed essential. So it will be interesting to track to what degree those roles come back. And in some, we're predicting you're not going to see the same level of employment for various factors that I'll talk about as we move along. Can we go to the next slide? It's not all doom and gloom. We are seeing continued growth in postings, in particular roles. And so there are pockets of opportunity. You can see some of these occupations here. And that's where we recently released a report last week. It's available on our website. It's part one, I think the less interesting part of what will be a two-part series, looking at what do you do right now in response to COVID and what do you do to win the recovery beyond the triage that needs to happen to deal with right now. I'll start with that right now piece, if we can go to the next slide. We are referring to a range of jobs that we are seeing still available right now across the US as lifeboat jobs. Many people, as you know, disconnected from work. Some are receiving unemployment benefits, some are waiting, some aren't. And we have a lot of people that need something for right now. So a lot of emphasis and a lot of questions we've been getting from the states is, can you help us identify what jobs are available right now? So yes, we can see who's hiring. We can see what occupations they're in. Unfortunately, lifeboat jobs can be great to get you across the immediate crisis and to hold you up in the waves that are crashing right now, but you don't necessarily want to row across the ocean. So we need to think of this as a solution for now, but also I've always said no job is a meaningless job or a useless job. There's always something to be gained, learned, and leveraged in any work that people engage in. And that's where I think we really need to put the focus on less on occupational titles and more on skills. And what does that mean long term? If we're accessing lifeboat jobs for right now, how do we find the ones that we're the best fit for if I'm a job seeker or could be ready for with minimal retraining in the now? And then how do I leverage what I'm doing within those roles to get somewhere else down the road? And that's where we talk a lot about skill-based career pathways. A lot of people talking about career pathways for a long time now. Largely career pathways mappings that I've seen were academic in the approach. People would say, well, based off of this occupation, you should be able to move on to the next occupation because they're in a related field and it seems to be a next step job. But that was often not based on any data from people's experiential reality. And so it could lead to suggesting paths that actually lead to more like career cul-de-sacs, places where people can't advance. At Burning Glass, we put the focus on trying to understand the genome of occupations. What's the skill requirements and demands and credential requirements for a role? And that's been evolving for some time. We've written about it for years, what we call hybridization. Even before COVID, what employers were asking for job titles that we've been familiar with for decades is no longer the same set of skills that they used to ask for. And so we're really seeing a rapid transition in the education and training provider infrastructure has not always kept up with that, leading people to go through education and training but still lack last mile skills or some of the things that really help somebody stand out and get attached to work that leads to meaningful careers. If we can bounce over to the next slide. So this is, these are just some visualizations, again, showing for the lifeboat opportunities, can I identify what's there now? What are some of the skills that will enable the next steps? And I know these will be shared, so I won't dwell too much on these right now. If we could go to the next slide. Again, some of the defining skill sets, right here, that attach to some of these roles. The roles, we see a lot of work for stock clerks, order fillers, computer network support specialists, business ops specialists, certain IT occupations, personal care aides and home health aides, particularly as people are trying to avoid hospitals and nursing homes. We're seeing some solid demand in landscaping, pest control, janitorial, and cleaning services that seems to be related to either seasonal changes or to COVID as well. In understanding the skills that you need, a lot of these things are skills that can be developed and that young people can fill these roles with the right information and right training. If we move along to the next slide. So here's what we see in terms of trends of building beyond the right now. What are some of the likely changes in occupations that will be available and that will drive the recovery. So you see the readiness economy, remote economy, diversified economy, and automated economy. And I can speak to a little bit about what these are about. The readiness economy, really, it's been, the crisis has thrown this right in our faces. Many people knew we needed changes and talked about infrastructure changes in healthcare and other things, including schools, for some time. Now it's unavoidable. So we know that there will be jobs, new jobs emerging in healthcare, infrastructure, cybersecurity, insurance, and environmental technology. The remote economy really has to deal with the changes where increasingly we're seeing employers, even though states are on a staggered reopening schedule, many employers, even if they're reopened, would prefer to have certain workers remain remote. They're discovering they could do certain tasks and functions just as well without necessarily being in the office, which may produce additional impacts on the economy if real estate and office space becomes imperiled. But for now, we do see that there will be increased needs for remote workers in various industries and roles, but they often tie back to software and data and IT related functions. Not exclusively, as we'll talk about in a moment, there'll certainly be roles for a lot of phone and customer support related outreach roles. But some of the higher paying remote work, which has already been part of the development strategy in rural areas around the country that have had to address periods of job stagnation well before the crisis, that's a strategy that can enable them to bring new opportunities into their areas. The diversified economy, this is an important concept, and we've heard some comments about manufacturing and will manufacturing, grow. The data suggests to us it's unlikely manufacturing is ever going to be what it was in earlier industrial revolutions in terms of the great employer of vast multitudes of Americans. However, manufacturing is transforming and transforming rapidly, and there are important opportunities, particularly in advanced manufacturing. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But in particular, one of the things that we're noticing and watching as a trend is reshoring. And the belief that supply, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, as manufacturing reshores, which COVID is providing extra impetus for that to happen, we expect to see new roles rise related to supply chains, logistics, and some other important areas. And then finally, the automated economy. This has to be presented as an opportunity that comes cased often, as is often the case with periods of great change. It's built on a lot of pain. We've observed from past recessions that automation within the economy tends to accelerate coming out of recessions. Employers place an emphasis on efficiency. They are less likely to rehire workers who are seen as lower value in the skill contributions or the tasks performed if they can cost effectively easily automate those roles. And also sometimes for health and safety reasons, there's a business case for the automation, and we expect to see another spike in automation, particularly now, given the realities of employers struggling to figure out how to bring back their industries with a set of restrictions that come with the recovery and the inability to, have workers working in close proximity, for instance, and high turnover or cost for people that they can simply replace. That's the unfortunate reality. But with that, there will be new jobs tied to automation. And so understanding those roles, what they are, and how somebody can prepare for them, the saving grace here is we've never seen a period where alongside of the technological advancements in the workplace, that there hasn't been a need for a human being. and human skills to contextualize whatever it is those new technologies do. If we can go on to the next slide. So here's what we see in terms of, from the data perspective, what the future may hold. The reshoring that I talked about, in particular, we're looking at manufacturing of medical equipment, apparel, devices, pharmaceuticals, returning back to the US, and production could be distributed across the United States. That's going to put new emphasis, as I mentioned before, on supply chains and logistics skills in workers. So that's an area where we see expected growth. And if we go to the next. We're very closely monitoring changes in demand for human skills, because typically in a recession, human skills have been a hedge against that automation impact that we talked about, developing those skills that you cannot simply expect a machine or a piece of technology to have or do. It's unclear, though, right now, whether the working at home, remote work increases, how the lack of face-to-face interaction might impact the demand and, importantly, the valuation of those human skills. So we're closely tracking that to see how critical that is and how employers express the need for those skills. Because that's an often overlooked area of talent development, but it's heavily emphasized by employers when they signal the market as to what they're looking for. Next slide. We do expect what some people call creative destruction. There's going to be new occupations, but in a way, like I said before, this has always been happening, because even the jobs or the occupational titles we're familiar with, the skill profiles and the demands have been changing for some time, where employers increasingly want somebody with a set of skills that used to exist in 3 or 4 different hires. So here we do see, some of the things that are top of mind and hot topics, like contact tracers. In New York, the governor talks about, he's on everybody's TV constantly, and I hear him talking about hiring an army of contact tracers. And we see evidence of this happening in other states as well. Early on, it's a lot of contact tracer hiring happening across Ohio and certain other states. And it's from healthcare systems, it's research facilities, it's a lot of different types of employers. So we've released a report and we're looking at roles like that, but that's not the only role we're expecting to see on the rise. We also see expected rises in health and safety experts, people with expertise in online training or instructional design, because the realities that COVID has wrought means educational system is finally getting a nudge to transform more quickly, and many institutions will have to respond both to the ongoing realities of the crisis, but also just a change in their field and their industry that existed long before COVID. A lot of competition, particularly at the higher education level, and a lot of challenges for a number of institutions, traditional institutions, to stay in business and to continue to attract students and to be seen as a useful pipeline of talent and partner for employers. So there's, we see potential roles in adjusting to the changes that COVID has wrought in education systems, and clearly within healthcare. As I mentioned before, home health aides, in roles where healthcare can be brought to a setting outside of a hospital or a nursing home. Also, we are seeing envirotech projected demand growth, which really cuts across a lot of industries and fields, and it can be everything from building systems and modern, HVAC technicians with integrated building systems to water jobs that have never really fully been classified in a federal occupation taxonomy, but that the factors and the data points that we track tell us will be critical, because for years people have realized access to clean water will likely become, water will be the new oil in terms of industry. Next slide. Infrastructure, again, something the governor of New York has been speaking about. A lot of people have been speaking about it for a long time, which is the point he's been making. Every administration as far back as I can remember, has talked about doing a major infrastructure bill for a long time. We've said our cities and our roads and our bridges are crumbling, and that's all true. And now COVID drives home that we need additional changes to a healthcare infrastructure. And it's other things as well that are less talked about, but will be huge drivers of the economic future. The broadband revolution. And that is going to require the building, maintenance, and securing of networks nationwide, and that's going to require new workers with new skills. Infrastructure, in some of the work that we're doing with partners, we really want to put a critical focus on this because it can be one of those drivers that if investments are made in infrastructure, and there's a lot that can be said as to why that's a compelling need for many reasons, that could be the absolute fastest driver of job recovery, job growth, and opportunity for workers across the spectrum. I think, we're drawing parallels at times, and I certainly can talk about this in the question and answer period, on lessons learned from the past recession to now. I think we also have to be really honest about where there are not direct parallels between those two situations. However, if there's something that we learned in the past, there was major investments. Tax grants were mentioned in what was done with the Trade Act, and a lot of federal money was put into trying to train our way out of a recession. And a lot of that is well-intentioned, and many of the investments had various degrees of success in terms of positive outcomes, but many did not. Because it's really critical that you don't put the cart of supply in front of the horse of demand without understanding what do you have to do to actually stimulate jobs to make sure that jobs exist, rather than just training people on the hope that in the future, if we have a lot of trained people, the jobs will somehow show up. And so we can certainly unpack that a little bit more later on. I'll just kind of wrap up here. We've let pass automation, but we've already talked about that we expect, the acceleration to continue. Here are some things that we would suggest monitoring in terms of data as you plan for reopening and recovery. Things we're paying attention to, clearly not just what jobs are available now, but how does that compare to before the crisis as states reopen? What's coming back and what's the rate of return, the pace of returning demand? Because we are anticipating that what has happened here is going to lead to structural change within local and regional economies. There are some sectors that will never fully recover and will not look the same as they used to. And so we need to start thinking about how regionally, and as Martha mentioned earlier, how groups of stakeholders that in a community that really need to be working in collaboration with one another, how can they effectively plan to get some control over the reframing of what the local economic mix looks like moving forward? And we're paying attention to things like, how do employers' offered wages and salaries change immediately now when unemployment benefits are high versus over time? Do we see a shift there? Credential and certification demands, how is that changing? When there's a high supply of available talent looking for work. Oddly, we've recognized in the past that sometimes when that's the condition, employers start to ask for higher certifications and credentials because they can cream out of a large pool of individuals looking for work when they can't necessarily engage in that same behavior if the market is much tighter for talent. And that can freeze people that lack certain degrees out if there's an overemphasis placed on a degree as opposed to something that's more effective evidence of somebody's ability to do the job. So yeah, I will just before we jump to questions, I want to say one important point is there's no shortage of data out there. Data's everywhere. I think that's why we're called burning glass. It's the idea that you could take like a magnifying glass and harness out of all the sunlight there. Let's put a laser focus on things that matter. Data should come with a warning. There's a lot of bad and useless data out there. There ought to be, I've often said, a set of data ethics. And so as you have the conversations back home about how to access data and information to make smart decisions to plan for the future, make sure you ask a lot of questions about the source, the quality, and really understand what the data is telling, because it can be manipulated in a lot of misleading ways. And I always say the only thing worse than basing decisions on no data at all can be making decisions based on unreliable or misapplied data, because people's lives and futures are at stake when you do that. So yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. I think you answered a lot of questions. I really appreciate that you prepared all these slides, which, let me answer all the questions that I have. What I'm going to do is bring you back into the larger conversation with everyone. And we have a few lightning round questions, Stephen. We have one or two for you. And then we have a general question for the entire panel.
Sure.
Yeah. So Shakima, Allison, Sam, Robert, Martha, are we all back?
All back.
Okay. Thank you for staying through here. I know you heard a lot, so we have about 10 minutes, I think, remaining, and we want to be respectful of people's time. So I'm going to ask a question here to Stephen, but I'm going to ask all of you if there's one pressing thing that you would like to respond to, or you can respond to, for everyone who's listening right now, what can they do starting today or tomorrow to advance young adult economic mobility? You can also answer that question. Stephen, we had a couple of questions I'm trying to combine here. One is about, how can you put younger workers at the front of the line? And how, what would you think of, what's your opinion around how government can contribute to job growth and support young adults in their recovery?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a tricky issue, because in the last recession, 2009, 2010, really what we saw was governments reprioritizing funding away from youth programming to focus on all the adults that needed jobs at the time. And that created a great danger of, I won't say a generation, but at least a broad swath of youth with no work attachments. And that can have major long-term implications on somebody's career success over time. Little bit different set of circumstances today, and even back then, places like New York City could weather that storm better than most, because it had such a vibrant philanthropic network and others that continued to fund youth programs. Here you have a situation where a lot of the jobs that may have been youth-related jobs simply cannot happen, because there aren't going to be summer camps and certain activities that may have been, jobs that were available. Yes, there's still a lot of roles that will return or that never left, and whether it's in grocery stores or landscaping or outdoor activities that will be there. But there's a challenge here, and there, like in the past, you've got youth competing with adults for a lot of these jobs right now. So it has to be a deliberate choice to put youth at the front of the line. I think what's often effective as a strategy is if we don't just take the altruistic argument forward of, oh, please serve, this group of high need individuals here or there, but instead you can advance the business case. Why does it make sense for employers to hire young people? And you can really emphasize the talents that they have, some of the skills that are unique and in demand in this market. Have it as a skill conversation first and foremost. And there may be cost savings to employers as well, to hiring or onboarding new talent and developing, the next generation. When we see a lot of business and industry, what they're suffering from is a total gutting over the past 10 years of talent in management, in middle management roles. So getting young people in the door now is an important strategy. where do I think the funding priorities should be? I think there needs to be an awareness that there's a long-term danger with major cost implications down the road if young people aren't able to connect work and start building work histories. So that is the incentive to invest in that now. And if you're going to invest in it, you have to invest in it intelligently, not just assuming the jobs of the past will be there. And finally, we've seen strategies in places like Birmingham does some really cool things right now. They have something you can learn about. The Mayor Woodfin's team has come up with a strategy called Tip Tap Top, talent investment, talent acceleration, and talent optimization. But among other things, they are identifying jobs that they want to incent to be in their community because they have a net multiplier effect on other jobs in the region. And they're trying to focus on economic development and bringing in employers and occupations that increase the city's and region's profile of what we call traded industries, bringing in outside dollars from somewhere else because their economy was growing more slowly than other cities because it was largely just a local fishbowl economy where the doctor pays, the baker pays, the so-and-so. Now they're really investing in tech hubs and startups, and they're put a focus on their young people and making sure that they have the skills, that they're the prepared workforce, that they connect to those jobs. And it's putting them on a positive path for not just economic growth, but personal economic resilience for the people who live in the city of Birmingham.
That's a great example, Stephen. We'll, try to find, get that information for you and post it so other folks can see.
Sure.
Shakima, I saw Allison, you pop on a few times. Martha, I saw everybody moving. So take again, if whoever wants to go first. Saying to the audience that we may go over an extra 5 minutes. If you can stay with us, we'll allow these lovely, our lovely guests to respond to some of the things that they're hearing. Allison, okay.
I was just gonna jump in super quick. One thing that I didn't get to say in my little presentation, but I did want people to note is that those basic necessities that I was talking about, it took me about 7 years to get them to be filled at a required level that would make sense for me to then have conversations about buying property, about having businesses that might be cooperatively owned or not, about launching a nonprofit or impacting my community on a larger scale. Understanding that means that when we're talking about 6-month outcomes for full-time placement and that everything will be great and a good job makes all the difference, it does. And workforce development was my key lever, but that's not the case for everyone. And oftentimes there are other more essential things that folks need in the immediate. And so again, I have to stress this. So I just have to stress this so much. Barrier removal services cannot be underestimated. Partnerships in order to introduce barrier removal services for young adults that need it is extremely important. And just keeping those things in mind that our goal as Urban Wild is to cut down the access to food, education, and gainful employment needs from 7 years to 2 years. Hopefully we can do that, but hopefully together we can do it even faster and do even more. So that's my only point.
Thank you, Sam. Shakima?
I mean, I think the best thing that we can do is not be paralyzed by every barrier or obstacle. I don't think that our task right now is to return to the normal or what we knew. I think we have to really think through what are we trying to build in response to and build it. And I think that, the biggest mistake that I see right now is that this kind of preoccupation with going back to what we used to have, when what we used to have didn't quite work well for, young people and certainly people of color. And so I've been choosing to use this opportunity to embrace what it is that I want to build and seeing every barrier as a step closer to me, becoming what we need to become, right? And I don't know all the answers, but I certainly know that going back to what we had was not working optimally, and I don't want to do that. And so I think naming your intention is really important. I'm not trying to to go backwards, we're trying to go forwards. And I think we're trying to build something new. And that means doing things that you've never done before. It means taking risks. It means, not having enough information or data. It's turned my organization literally upside down to go from a summer jobs program that was 120 hours a summer and, 6 weeks, and things that we can really measure around money. And it's scary. It's very scary. Time has very little meaning in our new conception of what we're trying to do. And there's a lot of unknowns, but we're moving forward anyway, with the goal of learning and improving from where we are. And maybe we've discovered a better way to scale to more young people who can't necessarily get to in-person jobs. Maybe we've removed the barrier of transportation and still allowed young people to earn resources. So I'm choosing to see what's possible and move forward in spite of the challenge. And I think that that's something that everybody can at least embrace and try.
Thank you for that. Robert?
Yeah, I think, as we heard all the data today and all of the perspectives, it is overwhelming. And so I do think, it's taking that first step of seeing what you can do on your local basis. For the community advocate side of the world, I do say that is a critical role right now, because budgets are being developed, both at the local level, at the state level, and definitely at the federal level. We need to be able to advocate at the federal level, as an example, to include youth in the next CARES Act. A $3 trillion proposal from the Democrats had very little resources for young adults. And matter of fact, I don't think was even mentioned other than we owe it youth. So that advocacy part needs to take place. And then secondly, I do think that the world of work has always been evolving. It's just going to evolve quicker. And I think if we don't have the skill-based approach to this, we are going to consistently leave behind a whole slew of kids that we are advocating for. So it has to be, whatever we do, has to be based on skill building specifically for this population, as well as the integration into the new economy.
Thank you. Martha?
I think our next steps are to build broader coalitions, find new partners, so that we can have people who often focus on equity talk with the people who focus on economic growth within a given region, so that we can have those two things happen together, so that economic growth does not happen while it systematically leaves people behind.
Allison? Thank you, Martha.
I think there's not a thing that's been said that I don't agree with. I would just say, one thing that I was reading a little bit, I've been thinking a lot about the Great Depression and thinking a lot about the experiences of maybe my grandparents and other folks who have been through these kinds of sort of socially reshaping events. And I think that the answers are not known yet, and how we need to proceed is not known. But what I worry is that we don't yet have a common vision for ourselves as a society and a community about what we want for ourselves and the future of our children. And that's what I think is standing in our way, is the continued division as opposed to that vision for equity. And that I think kind of investing in conversations like these, investing in conversations with folks who aren't like us, who don't have our lived experience, to get to that place is something that really needs to happen and needs to happen quickly.
Thank you, Allison. Stephen, any last words?
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, so many things to say. I do think it's going to take a lot of players to plan out a course. We do have an opportunity here, though, because there was a great shakeup. There's a great opportunity to rebuild and rebuild differently, as I think everybody here is saying. And it's a point I made years ago and probably got myself kicked off a project advising on a federal workforce project funded by USDOL. But my statement at the time, and something I wrote about, was fear being the greatest barrier to innovation. And when we think we have to stay within the lines of the rules as they've always been, or when we are beholden to funding decisions that leave out youth because they're less likely to be voting anyway, that holds us back from getting ahead. So we have to have really hard conversations, with education and training providers about how are they structuring and making available education, how are we making skills accessible, and what is, I couldn't agree more with what Allison was saying about what do we want our community to look and feel like, and in the context of the world of work. What opportunities do we want? How do we want them to interrelate? And then we have to plan for it and actually build it. So it requires information, but also passionate people that apply that information intelligently.
Thank you so much. Fear is the greatest barrier to innovation. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank everyone that joined us on the call. Hi, Sam.
We can't skip Robert.
Oh, no, they got me.
Oh, they did? Oh, okay. I'm quiet. I'm quiet.
I want to forget Robert. I want to thank all of you for joining us today and for taking the time to spend the time with all of us, everyone who's online who will join us today. Thank the team at JobsFirst. Go read the report, the early findings of COVID-19. You will see the recommendations there. Thank you for staying with us the extra time, and see you next time. Have a great
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.